All right.
Okay.
We're good.
Hope that's okay with everybody.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'll start with my land acknowledgement then. And I'm in Ontario, and Craig is in Manitoba. But as will become more apparent as we go along, we both are from Saskatchewan. We both went to the same high school in Weyburn, Saskatchewan. And so the land acknowledgement that I'm going to give is actually um, uh, connected to Saskatchewan because that's the place that I feel most connected to in my life. I've lived in Ontario, well, I've lived in Kitchener now for 20 years. Just still doesn't feel like home, but Saskatchewan does. Um, so that's the land acknowledgement that I'm going to give. So I'm a settler who was born in Treaty 4, which extends across what is now southern Saskatchewan. And those are the territories of the Nahiyawak, the Anishinaabeg, the Dakota, the Lakota, and the Nakota, and the homeland of the Métis and Michif Nation. Those lands are still home to Indigenous people across Turtle Island, and I'm grateful that I came into this world and spent my formative years on that territory, on that land. Okay, so Craig, you're going to introduce me briefly?
Okay.
Okay.
Who are you again? Wait, I got notes. This is actually gonna be really interesting because like Mark and I have known each other for approximately 121 years. And we grew up together. Like you were like in junior high and then high
Mhm.
school, and then you began to follow me around,
I did, yeah.
right? Because
Yep,
I moved to Winnipeg. No, I moved to Toronto. Then you moved to Toronto. Then I
yep.
moved to Winnipeg. You moved to Winnipeg.
Hmm.
Um, the restraining order never stuck. And you just kept following me around. And we're very good friends, so it's really fun to do this. And so a bit about Mark. That he grew up, like he said, in Saskatchewan, like me. He grew up in a small town called Griffin. I guess the farm wasn't in Griffin though.
No, about 3 miles
3 miles
away
out,
from Griffin.
like that,
Yeah.
right? And I grew up in Weyburn, which was like Griffin's about 10 minutes away. And I love what you said in your bio that you weren't interested in farming because your parents knew that you would likely lose a limb uh, trying it.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's kind of how I feel about farm too. Um, and then eventually, after U of R, you went off to U of T for your PhD, and also taught a while in France. I remember that. And for 12 years at U of W, University, the other U of W, University of
Mhm.
Winnipeg. Um, and You were also started your broadcasting in CBC. Mark
Mhm.
was known kind of locally as the word guy. That you were on radio a lot, talking about language for a regional show, and then nationally you were on Definitely Not the Opera for
Mhm.
CBC, and they were great columns. I didn't realize that you actually done more than 100 columns, like a lot of
Mhm.
columns. And you also co-founded the Winnipeg International Writers Festival, something that's still going on,
Mhm.
and wrote a whole pile of books. Actually, you wrote a lot of here too. You wrote for Gastronomica, the
Mhm.
Journal of Food and Culture, and I think you wrote for other food stuff too, didn't you? Like other
Yeah,
lot
like my first book was Cupboard Love. So it was
of
about
love,
food
right?
words, the
So
origin of food words. Yeah.
yeah, and so they were always these. It was just great, readable, like readable because sometimes you kind of go, I'm gonna publish a nonfiction book about food words.
Hmm.
Like, oh, that's exciting, but it was great. These are great books, and you wrote a lot about language, which is almost like grew out of what you were doing on CBC as well.
Hmm.
And you wrote, I have it down here somewhere. I probably remember this: Cupboard Love, The End, The Lover's Tongue, which was all about dirty words. I had to be careful in my house where I left that book. People picked it up.
Yep.
And Cooking with Shakespeare. And now you are off in Kitchener Waterloo. I visited you at your house. You let me
Hmm.
sleep in your basement, and you're teaching there. And also, you lived there for how long?
Almost 20 years.
Almost 20 years now.
Yep.
Wow.
Yep.
Um, 20 years. That's amazing. And then you and Melanie, who were here together, you met here, and then you adopted altogether 4 children. or
Hmm.
lovely, amazing children,
Hmm.
who I've met all of them. And all these dogs, you've had like 37 dogs in your life, I think. You've had so many dogs in your life. And it was just really very cool when I heard that you were writing this book, The Headmasters. And that's what you're going to read for us now,
Hmm.
from that, right, for 10 minutes. So
Yeah,
I'm just going to turn it over to you. I will
sure.
shut myself off and read to us, Mark, and then I'll come back
Okay.
on.
Okay, thank you, Craig. I'll show everybody the cover first. I love this cover. This was done. The book was published by Shadowpaw Press in Regina, and they hired a really great designer for the book cover. This captures exactly my sense of the spirit of the book. So I'm really happy with that. Really happy with Shadowpaw Press as well, and everything that they and the publisher Edward Willett has done there. Okay, so I'm just going to read from the beginning of the very beginning of the novel, um, as we said, for 10 minutes or a little less than 10 minutes, maybe. They did the coupling in the ward on a metal table with straps. I told Ivy and Knot that I didn't need the straps. I wasn't going to fight what I knew had to happen. I lay face down on the scratched and rusty surface of the table, my head sideways on the stained pillow, and waited. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see Knot reach into a dirty Nylar bag and pull it out, about as big as a big man's hand, black and glinting like the shell of a water beetle, shaped like an engorged woodtick. Knot told me he was sorry, then dropped it onto my back, right between my shoulder blades. It wriggled about, finding the right spot, and I sensed its cold suckers caressing my flesh, exploring, adjusting to the shape and size of its new host's small body. Suddenly it felt like glowing embers were pressing against my skin. Every muscle in my body clenched, but I didn't scream. I didn't even groan. I wasn't going to give it that satisfaction. Then I felt a new pain, much worse, a searing at the base of my skull, something burrowing in, something invading me. The hurt'll soon go away, Maple, murmured an old man, kneeling by my cot as I slowly opened my eyes. I didn't say anything, but raised my head slightly, wincing, and glanced around. I wasn't in the ward anymore. I was in a small, dim room with bare, cracked walls and one high window. I could hear the wind pummeling the window pane and felt a cold gust come through the frame. Cobwebs fluttered in the ceiling corners, making the trapped dead flies dance up and down. Despite the draft, the room smelled like dust and dried urine. I'd never been here before, but I knew where I was. My cubicle, the place where I'd spend the darkenings for the rest of my life. My back sang with pain and my head throbbed. I turned my eyes back to the old man beside my bed. Without saying anything, he put a cloth, wet with cool water, onto my forehead and gently rolled me from my back onto my side. The throbbing subsided slightly. "Who are you?" I asked. My voice was low and scratchy, like I'd been eating sand. "I'm your papa," he told me. "You're my granddaughter. You'll remember tomorrow. Getting coupled makes you forget things for a while." I nodded uncertainly. I didn't recognize the wrinkled face that peered out from behind his gray beard, but there was something about his voice that was familiar and soothing. His eyes were kind. Coupled. Yes, that's what had happened. One of the headmasters, one whose host had died a few days ago, had now been attached to me. 12 was young for that to happen, but they must have had their reasons. Through the window, I noticed the sky tinged with red. "Is it morning?" I asked him. He shook his head. "Almost night. The darkening will soon start, so I can't stay long." He flipped the wet cloth over on my forehead, his sands smelling like pine sap. "You've been coupled to your headmaster, Maple, but next it's going to start to link with you, a neural link. It won't hurt, but you're going to feel confused. You might see things that don't make sense. You might feel like you're losing your mind." He paused as he saw my eyes widen with fear. "I know you're scared," he continued, "just like I was when it was done to me a long time ago. But you need to keep strong and focused." He stroked my hair and gave me a sad smile. His furrowed brow told me he was worried. He went on. "It helps if you can hold a good memory in your head when the linking starts. Can you remember anything yet? Anybody?" I tried to think, but it was hard when my head was throbbing. Then something surfaced. Something furry. "Farley," I muttered. The last dog? Papa asked, his eyes lighting up ever so slightly. That's what you remember? I nodded as the memory began to bloom. Soft golden fur, brown eyes circled by rings of black, a tail quick to wag. He stayed with me when I hurt my leg, I said. When I fell in the forest, he kept barking. That's right, Papa said. Thanks to him, I found you and carried you back. He stood up. Keep thinking about him, Maple. Keep Farley in your head when the linking starts. Hold on to him, and he'll help you hold on to yourself. What was your memory? I asked him, not wanting him to leave. What did you hold on to when they did it to you? He was silent, and his eyes grew distant. Maybe you don't know anymore, I said, because it was so long ago. He shook his head. No, I remember. It was a memory of someone I hadn't known long, but who I admired. That was the memory I held on to. He squeezed my hand. My palm was damp, but his felt dry and rough. I need to hurry back to my cubicle before the darkening starts. I'll come back tomorrow when toil is over. He smiled again, turned, and limped through the doorway. As he stepped into the dark hall and closed the door, the last thing I saw was the bulge of a headmaster beneath his shirt. Papa was right. Not long after he left, my throbbing headache and the searing pain between my shoulder blades faded away. Instead, my back just felt numb and distant, like frostbite. Then, as Papa had said, the linking began. With its pair of sinewy coils now deeply wormed into the base of my skull, my headmaster started to establish its link with me. At first, it felt like I was sinking slowly into an icy stream, flowing in all directions. Then, tiny orange and blue and red fish appeared and began to bite at my skin, nipping off bits and gulping them down, their glassy eyes locked onto mine as they nibbled. As I sank deeper, the fish turned into formless shapes, smudges of color that slipped around my arms and legs, my face and fingers, as if they were examining me, then moved away. I released my breath, and thousands of bubbles escaped. My lungs escaped my lungs and rose around me. I could see into each one. I could see everything so deeply, each bubble enclosing a universe of galaxies, each galaxy whirling and throbbing, individual stars brightening, dimming, vanishing, planets spinning, masses of continents drifting, colliding, piling, creatures, innumerable creatures, minds, ideas, thoughts, words, symbols, everything meaning something, none of it comprehensible. Then it all melted away, and I was suddenly a tree, a maple tree, alone on a rocky hill in autumn. My red and yellow leaves began to pull loose, a rising wind tugging them free, the leaves scattering. The tree was bare, and I was nothing, gone. Then Farley rested his head on my lap, and I was sitting in a forest, my back against the maple tree, birds chittering and the sun just dropping out of sight. I put my hand on Farley's head, but it passed through, then swept through my own leg, then through the mossy ground I was sitting on. But that didn't matter. As long as Farley was there, I was there. I focused my mind on his warm brown eyes, then opened my own. The pink light of dawn was beginning to make its way through the small window of my cubicle. I was drenched in cold sweat and exhausted, but I felt almost normal, except for a vague sense that something was watching, listening, surveilling. I slowly sat up on the edge of my cot. Unsteadily, I got to my feet and made my way to the cracked mirror on the wall beside my door. Craning my neck around, I could see the headmaster's dark, glistening shell stretching from my neck to the middle of my back. Most of the shell was as thick as my thumb, but toward what seemed to be its head, where its two coils sprouted like the feelers on a water beetle, the shell got fatter, as thick as a man's fist. The other end, its tail, grew more narrow, tapering almost into a point. The whole thing seemed much heavier than it should. I felt weighed down and tippy. All my life I'd seen headmasters lurking under the shirts of adults, clinging to their backs like leeches. Still, it was hard to imagine getting used to this one being coupled to me, directing my actions for most of the day, even shaping my feelings. So that's the first few pages.
Wow. I'd forgotten the part about the little fishes, like the image of the fishes and stuff like that. And I
Mm-hmm.
remember because I've just read this quite recently, reading that that's near the beginning, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
the coupling near the
Very
beginning.
beginning. Yep.
And just so riveted right away. And also, like, I'm a pretty squeamish guy. I don't know if you remember grade 8, I passed out in science class. Uh,
Spiders, yeah.
and so I'm looking at this thing, I'm going, oh man, that's really gross. Can I keep reading this? So the thing I wanted to say, like, it's interesting that when Mark and I talked about doing this, is that Mark has written this dystopian book, and my most recent book is a crime fiction novel. So it's not like we're writing in the same genres. So it feels like we're going to both do reading, and then we're going to force it into some sort of fiction stew, But I think that we decided that you were going to read and I was going to read. Is that how it went? And then we'll
Yeah,
do an
yeah,
interview.
yeah,
All
yeah.
right. So, and by the way, Mark already said this, but if you got questions, throw them up in the chat. If you know how to put your hand up or clap or something, because like we should clap for Mark. Um,
Thank you.
I'm clapping for Mark. You can hear me clapping.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's a polite golf clap. So I'll turn it over for you. You can introduce me, and then we'll do the same
Yeah.
thing.
Okay. Okay. So I've got two components to my introduction of Craig. The first one is sort of fact-based. So Craig Terlson's short fiction has appeared in Mystery Tribune, Carve, Hobart, Punk Noir, and many other literary and crime magazines. 14 of these stories were published in his 2013 collection, Ethical Aspects of Animal Husbandry. Craig's first novel, Correction Line, was released in 2012, and a new edition was published just earlier this year. In 2017, he received his first nomination for Most Promising Writer from the Manitoba Book Awards for his novel Fall in One Day, published by Blue Moon Press. Craig published the first in a series of novels based on the character Luke Fisher in 2015. That one was called Surf City Acid Drop. The second novel in that series, called Manastique, was published in 2021, for which Craig received his second nomination in the Manitoba Book Awards. The third novel in the Luke Fisher series, 3-Minute Hero, that's the one he's going to read from tonight, was published in 2023. And also in 2023, he published his novel Samurai Bluegrass with Colorado publisher Literary Wanderlust. Craig has also written and co-produced 4 plays with his daughter at the Winnipeg Fringe Festival. So here's the second component now. This is sort of my personal introduction of Craig, based upon observing him for many decades. So Craig is the most artistically talented person I know. In addition to the many literary and theater accomplishments that I just referred to, he's also an excellent visual artist. And in fact, he made a career as a freelance graphic artist for several decades. I'm going to show you one of the books that I have right here. Um, I think most of what you did was probably for magazines and newspapers, but you did some books as well. He's also a musician, a great guitar player in particular, and also a songwriter, or at least back when we both lived in Winnipeg. I remember him writing some songs and performing them. I still remember some of them, but I promise I'm not going to sing them. I've known Craig, as he said, since we were in grade 9 at Weyburn Comprehensive School in Saskatchewan. That is 45 or 46 years ago. After we graduated from high school, yeah, we both went to Toronto for different reasons at the same time. We were there for a number of years. And then Craig left Toronto because, and I remember so distinctly him saying this. This is how he put it. He said he had to leave because the relentless sound of jackhammers had become intolerable. And so he moved to Winnipeg. And by coincidence, I wasn't stalking him. I also ended up in Winnipeg a few years later. And when Melanie and I left Winnipeg to move to Kitchener, it filled me with sorrow that Craig and I would no longer be living in the same city. Craig has a mind and a sensibility that are always curious and questing. Whether it's a Sam Peckinpah movie, or the band Wilco, or making a stew, or spending time with his granddaughter, or writing, he throws himself into everything with passion and commitment. And those are qualities I've always deeply admired. So now over to Craig, and he's going to read for 10 minutes or so from his novel, 3-Minute Hero.
There's no giant ticks in this book. Should have been. Yeah, this is 3-Minute Hero. I'm going to read right from the beginning. It should be about 10 minutes. I hope it's not very much longer. Everyone needs a benefactor, especially in a place that's not your home. After I ditched my home country and headed out for parts unknown, I needed to find a way to put beans in the cupboard. More importantly, after I arrived in Mexico, I needed to put Pacificos in the fridge. Truth was, I rarely stayed somewhere that had a luxury of a fridge. But there's plenty of places happy to provide a bucket of ice for my beer and a good vantage point to watch the sun slip into the Pacific. I made it a point to know as little about my benefactor's business as possible. At times it was hard to ignore, but generally I did what Benno asked. In return, he paid me well. Sometimes only my presence was required, playing glorified bouncer at his club when he was entertaining clients or making one of his deals. I didn't know if these deals were legal. My guess was they weren't. Other times my job consisted of giving dead eyes to anyone who might cause some trouble. And then there were situations when more was required, and I laid out my share of unruly clients. The first time Benno saw me deck a guy who'd been trying to hustle me, he let out a low whistle. Did you grow up in a place where this was taught? Benno asked. Like they say, the mean streets. And my streets are pretty tame, the usual small town fights. I spent some time as a sparring partner in Montreal. Sparring, like in a ring, the sweet science. I laid out the story to my new friend over a roll of tequila shots. I told him one day I started driving east, that I left behind the flat prairie and headed into roads that curved around giant rocks like titans from Greek mythology. That I eventually ended up in Montreal, a place I liked for the corned beef, bagels, and gitans, back when I still inhaled the coffin nails. I picked up some work at a boxing gym that trained the next great hopefuls. My forearms developed tight cords of muscle, and my legs could run for miles. So this is where you learn to fight, Benno interrupted. No, I always threw a decent punch. More than decent. Benno did not push the subject and allowed me to pause before he asked another question. Did you become one of the hopefuls? I told him, like a boxer who sensed the bell was about to ring, I felt the urge to be somewhere else. It was something that happened to me a lot. I was running out of land in my own country, so instead of going east, I turned right and kept going. My beater died just across the Mexican border, and I took a bus to Puerto Vallarta. I finished the story and swallowed the last shot of tequila. Benno asked if I could do a piece of work for him. Since that night in the El Rayo Verde, named for the flash of green that sailors claim they see before sunset, I've been working for Benno both in his home base at PV and occasionally on the road. I did end up in Montreal again, but I got pulled back to Mexico like a wayward dog who smells something cooking. People called me a private eye. I've never liked the term. Private eyes dragged up images of Philip Marlowe or that guy Rockford with his cool car. Hell, I never had anything that even looked like a license. There's just a guy who liked Mexican beers and, more than that, red sunsets over the ocean. I'd never seen the flash of green, but if you want somebody found, I'd find him eventually. If anything, I was perseverant or just a pain in the ass. Mano said that when I was working, I was like a dog searching for a lost bone, always with the dog metaphors. I returned to PV 5 weeks ago with the hope that Benno would supply me with the kind of work that paid the hotel bill and my bar tab. But not yet. Right now, the farthest I wanted to travel was the length of the Malecon and back. Luke, I need you to do a piece of work for me. Yeah, so he said, I said. Not Mexico, I'm guessing. Why would you say that? Benno asked. When you explain it as a piece of work, I usually find myself crossing a border. More than one this time, my friend. Direction, Benno? I picture driving south, winding through a number of Central American countries, each more dangerous than the first. Things had increasingly grown out of control down there as the dictators took turns trying to out batshit crazy each other. North, Benno said. Two borders? Yes. Put that one together fairly quick. Your little empire stretches all the way to Canada. The first rule of good finance, my friend, is spreading out your assets. You've heard the advice about eggs and baskets? Benno sipped his JNC. His club was closed for the night, and we were in his office. A block away, the ocean waves banged against the shore. Benno had cracked the window, and the smell of the Pacific wafted in, woven with the scent of what I guessed was fish being cooked over a fire. I doubt you deal much in eggs, Benno. Benno smiled and poured a couple of fingers of dark Jamaican rum into his glass and offered me the bottle. I waved him off and took another deep pull on a Pacifico. You have told me you don't want to know my business, he said. I still don't. Just if I'm making the trip to far north, I might need a bit more information than usual. It is yours. How does the song go, home and native land? Benno studied my face. Are you no longer welcome there? I doubt anyone would care if I showed up, I said. Well, maybe a couple people, but that's not the point. There were shouts outside, some late night touristas likely carousing the Malecon. What is this point you refer to? Benno asked. It doesn't matter. I finished my beer and walked over to the bar fridge. Why Canada? That may be the eventual destination. I don't have all the information. For now, I'd like you to go to Colorado. Who's in? I plunked back down across from my fedora clad friend. Oh, wait, now I remember. Last week you told me an employer of yours was stirring up shit in Colorado Springs. So you want me to find the guy that wanted to put a bullet in me and push me into a hole. I recall it differently, Luke. He brought you back safely at my request. I rubbed the back of my neck, pushing against the muscle tension that suddenly emerged. What's mostly Harold been doing? Benno gave a broad smile. I'd forgotten your name for him. Benno reached into his drawer and brought out an envelope. Our friend, or as you call him, my employee, has fallen out of communication with me. Told you that would happen if you hired Harold. So you did, Luke. And yes, this does have to do with Harold, or so I believe. He's been doing some work for me in his home city, but there is something else. To be honest, I'm not completely sure he's involved, but it is a place to begin. Shouts outside increased, and Benno peered around, looking through the dark bar and onto the street. Problems? I asked. Perhaps. I flinched at what sounded like gunshots, and Benno eased himself out of his chair and took a 9mm from his desk. He slipped it into the pocket of his jacket. I followed him out of his club. Teresa's getting out of control? Benno didn't reply. Outside, he moved quietly but with purpose. The street was empty except for a group of people in a semicircle next to a stone wall. Against the wall was a skinny kid in ripped jeans. The full moon cast shadows across the cobblestones. One of the shadows held a pistol in the air and fired it into the night air. As we walked closer, I saw the kid had a cut lip and a shiner the size of a plum. Gentlemen, there's no need for this, especially this time of night. Benno spoke in a cool, level tone. The one with the gun swerved to face us. None of your business, asswipes. Get lost. He was white-skinned, like me, not a local, working on a tan that showed up as a burn the color of prairie roses. Why are you threatening this young man? Benno asked. Little shit pickpocketed my wallet. He won't give it up, said a taller man with a thick mustache, matching red skin and a Hawaiian shirt. Do you have proof of this? Benno asked, his voice as flat as a beach. The punk banged into us when we were leaving the bar. We didn't notice it at first, but when he did, Perry's wallet was missing. Mustache guy swept his hand towards Perry, and apparently the one with the gun. Like I said, senior asswipe, move along. We'll take care of this. The kid at the wall spoke in Spanish, and Benno spoke back. Too fast for me to catch much more than gracias. Hey, none of that shit. You know this kid? Perry pointed at him with the pistol. I know his mother very well. I've known him since he was a small child. He's a good boy, not involved in crime. Did you find the wallet on him? Shorter guy with a beer belly hanging over his check shorts, came out of the shadows to add his 2 cents. He doesn't have it. He must have pitched it. Perry fired again in the air, making his friends and the kid jump. Enough of this bullshit. We're going to lay a beating on you, boy. I know you took it. I agree. That is enough. Put down the pistol before someone is hurt. I'll vouch for the young man. How much was in your wallet? Benno slid his hand into his pocket. Someone will get hurt, all right. Perry swung the sight over to Benno. I wouldn't do that, I said. Who the fuck are you? Just a friend. Will you take a step back, Mr. Friend? He wheeled his pistol at me. Benno pulled his 9mm out and put a bullet in each of Perry's kneecaps. He collapsed to the street screaming, the gun falling out of his hand. Holy crap, he shot him, Beerbelly said. Benno again spoke to the boy in Spanish, who gave a nod and ran down the street. You will phone for an ambulance to come for your friend. I suggest you all wait here. Hey, you can't get away with this. You just shot someone. Mustache guy came forward. I stepped in front of him and held up a single finger. I'll give you lugheads some advice. Shut the fuck up. Stay here. Wait for the ambulance. Go with your friend to the hospital. Currently, neither of you have any bullet holes.
Thank you, Craig.
Yeah.
That's great. Um,
So much violence.
well, and swearing, my
I
book
know,
has
swearing too. We should put a rating on this.
Um, I think there's already a couple of questions in the chat, but as we said, how about if you and I have a conversation? So I've come up with some penetrating questions to ask you and see
Okay.
how this
Should we just
goes.
kind of go back and forth?
Sure. Yeah. 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 Just play it by ear.
Okay.
So the first question I had, and I think people could hear that even in the opening passage or the opening pages that you read. But it seems like place is really important in your novels. And by that I don't just mean the name of a place, but rather the physical location, like the topography or the geography of where the characters find themselves. It seems like it's really important to who they are as characters. Is like what I mean is like we get a strong sense in your novels of how place shapes the characters, and that's whether it's a languid shore with a sunset near Porto Vallarta or the flat prairies of Saskatchewan. So I'm wondering, why is that, or is that, and if it is, why is place so important in your novels?
No, I'm glad you asked that because readers have told me how important setting is in my books, and they've kind of always been from the beginning. It wasn't something I did um, like on purpose. People thought it was because I was a visual artist,
Hmm.
and maybe it was that at the beginning. Like visual artists can talk about. Usually, I would be talking about paint colors, like vermilion or something like that, you know. But I think that somehow for me, um, characters, no, setting became a character.
Hmm.
It actually becomes another character in each of my books. And it's the reason that no matter what I'm writing, I do a ton of research and actually travel too. A lot of the books that are set in places that only that I've been. I couldn't imagine writing a book upon some place where I haven't been. And I've been to Mexico a number of times, and I've been to other countries too, but there's something about Mexico that I just love so much. And probably the last thing I'll say about that, because I'm a film guy, is that I like when people are situated in a place. You're right. Like you can feel the place. You know where people are at. In that, I could picture a Mexico night that Benno and Luke go out into on those cobblestones. If you've been to PV, it's all cobblestones. And so it really matters a lot, the setting, so much so that it's another character. And I want to go back to you now. This is my way of like segueing kind of thing. Is you grew up in the prairies, but Headmasters is in the Canadian Shield.
Hmm.
Now, I can almost write a book about the prairies without a lick of research
Hmm.
because it's in my head. So, can you talk about first, because we're talking about setting, the setting in the Headmasters? Did the Canadian Shield become like really special to you, or did you have to kind of research it, or it's like your second home? Like, how would you talk about setting in the Headmasters?
Yeah. Well, I live in Kitchener now, and my siblings are all in Saskatchewan still. Well, one is in Alberta. So we've driven across the Canadian Shield a number of times, like every summer, every second summer when the kids were younger. And I really, really love the Canadian Shield. It's, I mean, I guess the thing I've always found about the Canadian prairies, Saskatchewan prairies, is that it's harsh, it's bleak. It's beautiful. It's a really beautiful bleakness or a bleak beauty. And I feel that in a very different way with the Canadian Shield. I've never gone across the Canadian Shield in the winter, but still, when you're driving across it and you're just going through these not mountains, but the highway has been carved through the Canadian Shield, through the Precambrian Shield, and it's astonishing. You see the undulation of the strata of the rocks. You see the lakes. It's basically like tree, rock, lake, tree, rock, lake, forever and ever and ever. And it's got its own kind of beauty, but its own brutality, I think, as well. And so I wanted this to be a very Canadian novel. The main character I named Maple. But I also wanted it to be set in a very remote and harsh place. And so that's why I set it in Northern Ontario in the Canadian Shield, because I think the Canadian Shield in the middle of winter is probably a pretty harsh place. And in the summer, the black flies and mosquitoes and everything like that, it's a pretty harsh place any time of year, I think. So yeah,
Have you ever, sorry to interrupt you, but did you
yeah, yeah.
ever think about setting it in the prairies?
No, I never did. That's partly because I wanted it to be, I don't want to give anything away, but I wanted it to also be near a mine, like a nickel mine. Um,
Mm,
and so that's why I wanted it's sort of in my mind it's sort of set, I don't know, 100 miles or so from Sudbury. That's how I imagine it in my head, near the French River. Although nobody knows in the book, nobody knows what these places are called anymore because sort of the past has been forgotten. Um, but yeah, setting is really important to me. And in the second novel that I've written, but haven't got a publisher for yet, takes place in Winnipeg and France around the time of the end of the First World War. And there too, I really enjoy visualizing. Like because I know Winnipeg quite well, and I did some research about, looking at photographs, historical photographs. I feel like I've got that place in my head pretty well as well. Yeah.
mm,
Yeah.
cool.
Um, a couple people have put some questions in already, but one of them kind of touches on what was it again? I just want to say something else that I had asked.
Well, there's one about the Coen brothers, which is,
Yeah, yeah, that's
um,
that's that's the one that twigged because
yeah,
let me ask this question. So, and maybe this is because I know you so well for so long, but when I read your novels, I get this feeling or this sense of a lot of other works kind of whispering in the background. With the one you've read from today, 3 Minute Hero, I thought I could feel echoes of the Coen brothers, like Fargo, things like that. Of Cormac McCarthy's novel No Country for Old Men, I could feel that. But I mean, your novel, it's almost like some of the elements of No Country for Old Men are taken and treated humorously. Like the character, what's his name? Sugar in No Country for Old Men, who's just this horrifying guy. Harold is a killer, he's a hitman, but there's something kind of endearing and goofy about him almost. Like his love of Burt Bacharach, for example. And I can sense things, I think, like genres like film noir, Japanese movies, spaghetti westerns, Sam Spade detective novels. So I'm wondering if I'm right in sensing those things, and if so, how intentional is it to bring those things in, or is that just your way of being?
that's a great question. My first novel was picked up, I had representation in the States, in New York, and the agent was the first one that said, "This sounds like the Coen brothers." And I guess because I'm such a film guy and a big reader, I've been a voracious reader my whole life. There is kind of a thing where almost by osmosis, all this stuff comes in. And I love reading reviews where they kind of say, "Oh, I see the Coen brothers," and someone will say, "Oh, I see James Crumley or J.D. McDonald," other crime writers, or McCarthy, which is super high praise, like No Country for Old Men, which I've read a bunch of times and saw the movie a bunch of times. It sneaks in there, and I think that all those influences are all kind of in this stew in my head, and they
Mhm.
kind of come out. I write a lot of. That's why we were chatting a bit before about process. I'm a total pantser. I just write, which means I have to do a lot of editing afterwards, right? But I let stuff
Pantser meaning you write by the seat of your pants.
speedy through
Yeah.
pants,
Yeah.
exactly. Pantsers versus outlines, right? And pantsing just works for me. I met Terry Fallis one time in Stratford. We were in Stratford together, right?
Mhm.
And Terry, great Canadian novelist, writes out outlines that are 80 pages long. And I'm like, oh my goodness, how could you do that? So I'm just going, but that also means that my subconscious is going, and a lot of stuff sneaks in. I'm not trying to echo the Coen brothers or McCarthy or Travis McGee from McDonald's books or Elmore Leonard or anything like that, but they just sneak in. And I
Mhm.
guess I love the comparison between Shakur and Mostly Harold. Mostly Harold was a gift. He is someone who readers love to talk about, so much
Oh,
so.
can you explain why he's called mostly Harold as well?
Yeah, yeah, good, yeah. Thanks. In the first book, Surf City Acid Drop, Harold Killer, hitman, who happens to love Burt Bacharach and wears snakeskin lizard boots, um, is goes under a bunch of names, a bunch of aliases, but mostly Harold. And Luke calls him mostly Harold, which Harold hates. He hates being called that. Harold, I see almost as one of the angriest men alive. And I have a lot of fun with the anger. So you're right. Different than Shigur, who scares the heck out of you, like in the McCarthy books and in the film, played brilliantly. Harold is a killer, which you're reminded of in several parts in the book. But he's also kind of like, he's just a goof, you know? And so I think for me and you, I was going to ask you about this too, like voice being so important. You've known me for a long time, and humor is important to me, you know? And so there's these kind of undercurrents of humor. And even in the sense of like, I feel like I fell into crime fiction by accident. And I kind of go, how could I write crime fiction? I haven't done really any crimes. And I've never known anyone like mostly Harold. So I'm playing with tropes, but I'm trying to turn them a little bit on their head,
Yeah.
hopefully, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And I want to build upon that a bit. I should say, if you hear any snoring or panting in the background, it's not my wife. It's not Melanie. I've got two of our dogs are in here, and they're starting to snore. But yeah, I wanted to talk about some of the metaphors because your prose is so full of such great metaphors. I've jotted a couple down here. So this is one where Luke and I forget who he's with, but they're in a vehicle and it's almost doing a rollover. And you write, we went into another skid like we were in the ice capades, except we were skating with goons. I love that. Or this one, his belly jiggling like an underdone pudding. The third one, words came out of me like lava lamp bubbles, floating to the top, but then sinking again without any real purpose. Like they're so vivid, but
Yeah.
they're also, I think, very clever, very witty. I see that as one of the main characteristics of your prose is the way that you're able to do that, but just in the right amount. Like, too many metaphors and similes, and it starts to seem kind of overdone. But
Well, and I've got like to slip over into kind of some personal stuff. I got so much stuff to thank you for. You introduced me. I still have the piece of paper somewhere. All you wrote down was George Saunders.
mm, mhm,
And I have read absolutely everything Saunders has published. And he's a huge writing hero for me. And what I learned from Saunders when he's being edited by the New Yorker is that you have to learn to cut out. If you got three similes on a page, cut two of them. It's hard to cut them, but the
mhm,
one remaining will be way better, kind of
mhm,
thing. And so that kind
mhm,
of craft stuff, because a lot of these things they come out of subconscious. I don't know where they come from. You were talking about the Canadian Shield, even in the section that I wrote, or sorry, I read about them driving through, and I think I say something like Titans from Greek mythology.
mhm.
That's what I think about when I drive through those big
Yeah,
red carved out kind of stuff,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
And so I like to have fun with that kind of language. And I guess I'm going to kind of sort of slip over because we're talking about language and stuff, is that like language is big in this book, but
Mhm,
there's so many questions I want to ask you around like how you decided to write a novel first with this premise. I mean, I asked this knowing I don't like getting asked this question myself, but the premise of these controlling bugs and this dystopian world. I'll ask it this way in two parts. Part one is like language where the world doesn't know how to talk to each other anymore,
mhm,
feels very allegorical,
mhm.
and then bugs that are oppressing us um, feels also very allegorical. So because did you have an outline or how does things start? And how does some of those allegories, or maybe they're not allegories, maybe they just came out. Did you discover that as you went along the way?
Well, I started with two things. One was an image, and one was I guess, a notion. The image was of the headmasters. Growing up in Saskatchewan, I guess out here too, but especially in Saskatchewan, on the farm where I grew up, wood ticks were everywhere. At least, certain times of the year, and I absolutely hated wood ticks. They'd get on me or on my dog's ears or whatever. They just freaked me out. They continue to freak me out. And so when I wanted to write a novel, I thought, what's the creepiest thing that I could imagine? And for me, it was wood ticks. And so I thought of the headmasters as these creatures that are kind of like wood ticks, kind of like water beetles, that attach themselves, but they're big, they're plate size. So it was that image. And then the notion of the concept was like I've always been really fascinated with memory, losing memory, keeping memories. In fact, one of the courses I taught at the University of Winnipeg was about memory in literature. Um, and I mean, there's lots of reasons I think why I've got that interest, and maybe everybody does have an interest in memory. But for me, it goes back to, my grandmother when she was getting older, and she began to lose her memory, wouldn't recognize her husband even, but could still remember songs from when she was 12. Things like that. It's just so strange. And then for me, some people, actually, I don't know if I've ever even told you this, but I have prosopagnosia, so face blindness, right? So I have a lot of difficulty recognizing people. It's like I can't remember their faces in my head much of the time. Um, and yet I have, I think, a really good memory for other things. Um, so yeah, I wanted to write a novel, a dystopian novel about what would happen in a world where memory was not allowed. And that's why I won't go into the details of why that is the case in this novel, but basically memory, talking about the past is forbidden. So not just personal memory, but cultural memory, in other words, history, are forbidden in the world of the headmasters. I just found that like a really, really interesting concept to try to explore because without memory, I mean, who are we? What are we? Nothing really, if we don't have our
Well, and
memory.
in memory, I want to pick up on that because memory is such a huge theme in this book that and memory and trauma,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Because my wife, as you know, is a psych nurse, and she's
Hmm.
done studied on trauma. We've talked about this, about how you work with memory and how it can trigger the past.
Hmm.
And in this case of this novel, something's really bad, like triggering the past, could actually end up in death. Like you
Yeah.
have people that you call the berserkers and stuff, or they're the ones that try to just get the stuff off their back. By the
Hmm.
way, there's sometimes this book scared the hell out of me. So thanks for that. Reading the giant wood ticks. Oh my God. But it's sort of like you're dealing with so many things. And is that, again, I don't know if you're outlining, but how did you start? Did you start with that idea or did it come as the story progressed in your mind?
I just pursued it as it progressed. I mean, and another thing I guess I should bring in here though too, a third element, and you're quite right in saying it's a book about trauma because the people in this novel are all traumatized. Who wouldn't be with the
Yeah,
gigantic wood? I was going to say woodpecker, not a woodpecker,
that's a
wood,
different book.
yeah, wood tick on their back, and that has a lot to do with the four kids that Melanie and I adopted as older kids, and obviously kids who get adopted at older ages, they come with trauma because that's why they've been taken away from their birth family because of the awful things that they've usually experienced. And so I wanted to write about that, but also about resilience because all four of our kids have uh, demonstrated such resilience in dealing with trauma and getting through it, that I wanted to pull that into the novel because that's where the hope comes. It's Maple is an extremely resilient person. She has access to something else that also makes her sort of the protagonist, the hero. But yeah, I wanted to talk about trauma and resilience. And I didn't have an outline when I started writing. I just sort of started writing and found my way through it. There were many nights where I'd wake up in the middle of the night and I would just lie there and I'd think, okay, what's going to come next? What's going to come next? And I would just think and think and think.
Mhm.
And sometimes I would have eureka moments like, oh, okay, that sounds really cool. Other times it would just be, okay, I'm going to try this and see how it goes and write my way through it. So yeah, I guess I would say I also tend to write by the seat of my pants, the seat of my lederhosen, because I'm out here in Kitchener. So
And you actually have to wear lederhosen in that. A lot of people don't know that. I know I have
it's a
some
bylaw.
American friends here. It's a bylaw in Waterloo. You have to wear lederhosen all the time. That's a hardship.
Should we ask each other more questions, or should we turn to the
Well,
what do you call it?
let's do a bit of both. Let's
Sure.
see. What do you see there? There was from Ken
Hmm.
um,
Hmm.
about Ken and I read this book together. Ken's a good friend of mine. Um, would you consider revisiting the Headmasters again, perhaps from their perspective, the Headmasters' perspective?
Yeah, if I were to write a sequel, that's definitely something that I was thinking about. I haven't written a sequel yet. As I mentioned, I've finished a second novel. I'm halfway through a third novel. But I didn't start writing a sequel to the Headmasters because I thought, well, what's the point of writing a sequel until it gets published? And that took a while. But once I'm done the third novel, yeah, maybe I'll come back and write a sequel to the Headmasters because I do think it would be cool to write it from the perspective of the Headmasters, because on the one hand they are awful, brutal creatures, but on the other hand they're just doing what they do. Like I say to our kids, whether it's our dogs or any kind of animal, there's no reason to ever get mad at any animal. They're just doing what they do, you know.
Mhm.
And same thing in a way with the Headmasters. I mean, they are awful and they are cruel, but they are just doing what they were created to do.
And I think you
So,
do that really well in the novel. Like, I mean, like it wasn't so much I ever had empathy for them,
mhm,
you know, but part of it is, that we don't know a lot of the
mhm,
why they're there,
mhm,
but you put it there that they are communicating as a collective. I heard
mhm,
in another interview that I was listening in prepping for this, that you had just where you say like, how are animals communicating to each other?
mhm.
That was going on that we're unaware of that.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Because basically, why the headmasters are attached themselves to this community of humans is because they're using the humans to communicate with each other, with other headmasters. Um, and yeah, I've wondered too, how do animals communicate with each other without language? Like, do they communicate through metaphor or what? Um,
Hmm.
yeah. Um, Craig, this question from Kenneth, actually, also from Kenneth again. Do you prefer to write dialogue first and then fill in a scene, or vice versa? I'm curious about that.
Yeah, I mean, it all just comes out, right? And I think what I'm aware of, I think I've learned, and people have told me that I'm pretty good at dialogue, which is why when I switched over to writing plays for a while,
Hmm.
um, one of the best things about writing plays is when you hear an actor say your words out loud, you know right away if they're shitty,
Hmm.
or if they're false, or they just bump. And so this really just kind of comes out in a flow. So I never separate it. I never kind of write dialogue and then write stuff. There's a later question about editing. I do a lot of editing, but usually the scenes just kind of come out of me. And I have to be aware in a scene of what's going on all around. And that's not just visual, auditory, touch, and that's probably where some of the metaphors come out, and you kind of go, well, what is the situation that they're in? And the thing that I love about dialogue, and it's an adage that I keep in my head a lot, is I think that dialogue should only do one of two things. It should either advance the story or reveal character. And because that's why I say characters in novels don't talk like we talk, because
Hmm.
if they did, it'd be really boring.
Hmm.
And also I would say, like, I mean, it's, and this, how you flow out of dialogue into narrative summary and back. And it's another thing that headmasters I really admire, that you're talking and then you're out of that. And even in the conversation in the opening section between Fisher and Benno, at points he's summarizing what he's saying, because you
Hmm.
don't need to say the whole thing. That would just be
Right.
boring to the reader, right? And so
Hmm.
I'm always thinking about the story moving forward. But I also want to, these books for me are a lot about character. I'm revealing who these people are. So
Hmm.
no, it kind of comes all together. I never separate it out.
Hmm. Hmm. Robin's wondering, how do we feel about the role of the editors that we work with? And I guess I mentioned in passing earlier on that with Shadowpaw Press, the publisher and my editor was Ed Willett, who just by coincidence, when I worked at the Weyburn Review newspaper when I was 17, he also was working there. And then, 45 years later, he ends up publishing one of my books. Strange how things come around. Anyways, he was a great editor, uh, and such a savvy publisher as well. I want to say what Ed is doing with Shadowpaw, based in Regina, and focusing on publishing Canadian authors and bringing back into print authors who have been out of print for a long time,
Oh,
especially ones focusing uh, like sort of classic science fiction ones. Oh, he's also going to be republishing Covered Love, my first book as well,
that's
next year. So
great.
that's
Great.
good. Yeah, how who edited your work?
I've worked with different editors, but before we go over there, I wanted to say it was just kind of like, it was just funny because when you grow up in a small city like Mark and I did in Weyburn, and you just know names, and everyone knew Eddie Willett,
Hmm.
who I guess is now Edward Willett.
Hmm. Hmm.
In my mind, he's still Eddie Willett. And he worked for the Weyburn Review, and Mark worked for the Weyburn Review, which was the local paper. And Mark came and took my picture when I was working at the golf course.
That's
Remember that?
great. Yeah, I
Right?
do.
It was
I
just
still
sort of
have
like,
it.
and so we have all these kind of these connections. And so when I find out that Eddie Willett's editing your first novel, I was like, what? Editors, I love two pieces. I adore editors and what they do because I can't get outside of my work. I
Hmm.
try as best as I can, and I've worked for different editors. You mentioned Fall in One Day. I met a editor named Alistair from North Bay, who ended up actually being the editor on Manastique as well. Samurai Bluegrass was edited by Mandy Miller down in Colorado, and 3 Minute Hero was edited by Jim Thompson in Washington. Um, it's sort of like it depends on substantive or copy editing question of
Hmm.
what they do, because substantive is actually looking at the structure, and I've had that kind of editing which has been really helpful. And then my copy editors are also editors that look close for things like continuity and stuff, and it's just a way of, I guess the way I'd summarize it, it just helps me get outside, because one of the hardest things to do is get outside of your own work. And it's not even just continuity, like just like, didn't that person have brown hair in chapter two? It's more like this doesn't sound right. Like,
Hmm.
I'll give you an example, that an editor mentioned something in a novel that this relationship sounds like, it was in Fall in One Day. It sounds like Stockholm syndrome, where um, you fall in love with your kidnapper. What is it
Hmm. Hmm.
like that kind of that thing, right? And this book, Fall in One Day, was set in 73. And I had to like go research, and I go, oh, it'll kill me if Stockholm Syndrome was from 75. And as
Hmm.
luck turned out, I think it was earlier in 73 that it came out.
Yeah,
And
with Patty
he,
Hearst. Yeah,
right? And he pointed that out, which I'd never heard of it before. Sorry, I never made the connection. But editors can point stuff out that you will not see.
yeah, yeah,
And so they're hugely important to my work for sure.
yeah, yeah. I have to mention quickly another reason I was really glad that Ed Willett was the editor of my book is it finally gave me the opportunity to actually say Ed edited it. It's a sentence I love. Ed edited it.
Do you remember the other one? You taught me that one. I've used in my class. I teach as well. Ed edit it was when you call out roll call, and
Hmm.
it's Bob Robert,
Uh-huh.
Lob Law,
Oh yeah,
like the grocery store
yeah,
Loblaws, right?
yeah,
You
yeah.
go blah blah blah, blah
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 blah,
blah.
blah blah
Yeah,
blah, and then your students will start laughing, right? I
yeah,
remember that from Ed edited as well. This other question, there's a couple here. This
yeah.
is totally what I wanted to talk about too, is about science fiction. I was also surprised, Mark.
Hmm.
Like, were you a big sci-fi guy growing up, or why did you end up sci-fi dystopian here?
Yeah, when I was a teenager, from 13 on, all I read was science fiction, and then I went to university and stopped doing that and only read well, 16th century authors for a long time.
Right.
Um, but I don't even consider the Headmasters to be science fiction. I mean, there's not a lot of science in it. It's like all the science has been taken away. It's maybe speculative fiction.
Mhm.
but it's certainly dystopian.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I love
The question is
dystopian.
like the part two of this, I don't know, is towards me or towards you, is the style, whose style have you ever been attempted to emulate? And I want to say that in a different way or add to it, is that because you are so steeped in literature, 16th century stuff, but also both you and I growing up with sci-fi and all that. Were there like ghosts of other writers in the back of your mind that you were thinking that you're emulating, or did you kind of just put that stuff away? Almost like when you asked me about my influences that are whispering. Like
Hmm.
who's whispering to you?
Hmm. Well, I mean, the authors that influenced me a lot, and I don't know if they enter into the Headmasters, but the first one would be Farley Mowat, the Canadian author Farley Mowat, who, when I was about 15, I wrote him a letter, sent him a short story I'd written, and he very kindly replied and said, yeah, just keep writing and you'll be a writer. And it was very meant a
Yeah.
lot. Like it just meant so much. Um, I really like Cormac McCarthy, but we've mentioned him before, but I would never, I just don't know I don't know how he does what he does.
Mm.
It's like, I think you and we used to go to bars sometimes and play chess, and occasionally, we would play people, um, like there were these, two fellows, and they were visiting from, somewhere in the Middle East, and they were, where chess was sort of invented. Um, and they wanted to play us. And when I was playing them, it felt like I have no idea how this person is beating me because they were just so much better. They were making moves that I could not understand. And Cormac McCarthy is kind of like that for me. I just don't know how he does what he does. It's just so good.
That's a really good way to say it. And that's, just because you're twigging my memory that Mark taught me how to play chess. In my memory, it took me 3 years to beat you.
Did that happen? I don't know. I've
Did
forgotten
it,
that.
it happen?
My
Yes, I
memory.
did win sometimes. Did it happen? And
Yeah.
so I taught my son chess kind of thing. What's really funny about that is I taught him chess. It took him quite a while to beat me, but when he beat me, he made me fill out a piece of paper that I had to sign that was up in his room the day that he defeated me, kind of thing. But this whole thing about this, chess is a good metaphor for. I read McCarthy too, or I read Don DeLillo. Don DeLillo is one of my
Hmm.
favorite authors.
Yeah.
I don't know how he does it,
Hmm.
and sort of like emulating. You mentioned Farley. I met the original Farley, a
Hmm. The
beautiful,
dog.
gorgeous, gorgeous dog. Was he named after Farley Mowat?
Yes. Yes, he was. Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So we send to our what do you call our heroes? You know who I wrote a letter to? I wrote a letter to Guy Vanderhagen
Mm, hmm.
in
The
Saskatchewan,
Saskatchewan.
California.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then same thing. He wrote back, and it was just so
Hmm.
amazing in that way. So, did you answer why dystopian, or just like you don't even necessarily?
I guess the reason I like watching dystopian movies and zombie movies and things like that, and reading dystopian novels and writing them is because to me, it strips away so much, and we can just sort of get to the bone right away. It's like, I don't know how to write about Starbucks or about, I don't know, purses, things like that. Um, and so if I set it in a dystopian world, none of that is there. I can just kind of focus on character, and it brings character to the surface, I think, very quickly. So it's a crutch kind of for me is why I do it. Um,
I get
yeah,
it.
yeah.
Because I think that like crime novelists talk about this. I've since met a lot of crime novelists. Again, I never intended to be a crime novelist,
Hmm.
um, but we try to set stuff before there was Google,
Hmm.
before there was cell phones, before there was all these things, because it
Hmm.
just changes everything.
Yeah.
And the other one that's always bothered me is my wife Carrie is really good at gardening and plants and stuff like that. And I don't know, it's a tree. I don't know what kind of tree it is. And so I read these great novels that have this wonderful descriptions of stuff. And sometimes it's really hard because I
Hmm.
feel what's my crutch there. And
Hmm.
so it's the same with Spanish. I know a little bit of Spanish. My Spanish is really bad. So I
Hmm.
make Luke's Spanish really bad that he
Hmm.
doesn't he
Sure.
doesn't really know. And I think that you know, we write what we do out of as authentic as we can be.
Hmm.
Which brings me to this one here. This is a really good one from EK. Um, of the writers you most admire, which three have you found to have the best advice in terms of craft? Why don't you answer it, and then I'll answer it.
Well, I'll just give one. Um, and it would be Stephen King. And a lot of what Stephen King writes, of his 3,000 novels, I don't like. Some of them I really, really like. But his book about writing is really, really, really good. And, basically one of the things he says, if you want to be a writer, sit down and write. Like, don't daydream about writing. Sit down and sit there until you start writing. And if you have to sit there for 3 hours and then stop without having written anything, that's okay. Just the next day, come back and sit down and write a, wait until you can just do it. In other words, think of writing as a craft, not as not as a inspiration, coming from Zeus.
You said something a long time ago when you were working at U of W. I might get the quote wrong, but when you were doing stuff on CBC and things like that, and some of your academia friends might kind of go, "Oh, that's you should be like publishing in literary journals and stuff like that,
Hmm.
not doing
Hmm.
this thing," right? And you said something that, believe it or not, has stuck with me all these years. You said something like, "Give the people what they want."
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's always stuck with me because I'm also a huge Stephen King fan. Not all of it.
Hmm.
Some of it's kind of crappy, but I've read that book on writing so many times.
Hmm.
And I always say when people are trying to learn the craft, I say, okay, read Stephen King's on writing and then read John Gardner's Art of Fiction.
Hmm.
And they're two totally different books because
Yeah.
the Art of Fiction gets really, really into deep literary structure and stuff like that. And you
Yeah.
go back and forth from those because a lot of it is just do it. Just do
Yep.
it.
Yep. And even someone like Shakespeare, I mean, why did Shakespeare write? Well, he wanted to make money. You look at his life, he was a very ambitious person. Um, it wasn't as if he was, um, wanting to, I don't know. He wasn't thinking, I'm going to write something that people are going to be interpreting 400 years later. He wanted to write a play that would get people coming to the Globe Theater.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think one also has to write for oneself. I mean, I don't write something thinking, oh, um, I won't write this unless I'm certain that it will sell really well, because that's never happened. Um, I do have one other question though that I wanna ask you, and then if other people have other things or if you have other questions, but here's my question for you: Why do you write? Why did you start writing, and why do you write?
So, when you're a kid and they ask you what you want to be when you grow up, the very first thing, because I was such a big reader when I was like 2, 3 years old, whatever like that, I said I wanted to be an author. I didn't even say writer, I said author. So it was always there, but I have this side of me that's very, visual arts, and that ended up being my career. And I always felt like I'm going to write stuff when I finally have something I want to write about. That's probably why I started in more of a literary genre, because
Mhm.
I thought, well, I'm going to write this stuff with like big heavy themes in it and stuff like that because I want to explore stuff. But the more I wrote, when I first started to write, I felt it was time. I don't know how old I was. It was like, well, actually, I know the weekend I started writing. I started writing the weekend of Lady Diana's death. I don't know. It
Mhm.
always reminds me of that. And I started to write, and I realized a couple things to explore the world. And people that I've had, like both agents and publishers, hate that I can't stay in one genre because I will write a book that's more magical realism, slipstream. I'll write a crime novel. I'll write a literary thing. But all of it is me exploring the world I live in, exploring character, exploring the big human condition, even in the Fisher books, right? Because when I first wrote Surf City Acid Drop, I don't want to get into a big history of publishing, but I was at a really low point and I wanted to quit because I was getting so close to big deals. Neil Gaiman, the big
Mhm.
American Gods guy, his editor from William Morrow was reading my first novel. I was like, oh, here we go. And as you know, in publishing, it doesn't happen that way. And so I was really beat up by a lot of them. And I said, you know what? I thought writing was supposed to be fun. What do you like? What do you really like? What do I like? I love 1970s anti-heroes. I love characters like Philip Marlowe. I love these kind of sun-baked neo-noir settings. Why don't you just write like that? And who gives a shit if anyone reads it?
Mhm.
And so I wrote Surf City Acid Drop, and it's the most fun I've ever had writing a book. And so I put it out there, whatever, you know.
Mhm.
Um, and a prof came up to me, a colleague at the university, and said, I want to know more about this guy, this Luke Fisher guy. And I went,
Mhm.
oh, I never thought of that. And that's why there's almost, I don't know how many years there are between book one and book two, but I just never thought that I should explore this guy more. And
Hmm.
as I explore him, I explore myself. And the thing that I've just really realized, and Carrie pointed it out to me, there is nothing right now that feeds my creative soul like writing.
Hmm.
And even I miss painting sometimes. I was an illustrator for 26 years. I used to paint all the time. I miss that a little bit. But if I'm not writing, I'm miserable, you
Hmm.
know. And it's sort of like maybe I wonder for you, like Maple and Papa and all these characters living in your head, like they must become really real, you know, like they live in your head and then you give them to the world to live in other people's heads. And that's
Hmm.
how I feel about, I love them. People love mostly Harold. I go, we know, and they feel bad. They feel bad. There must be something wrong with me. I love mostly Harold. And no, I love him too. He's great. I would never want to meet him as a person
Hmm.
because he's a killer, you know.
Hmm.
But the same as like these people live in our heads. And it's not like I don't want to get all kind of mystical about it, but there's something about it that allows us to explore ourselves. And that feeds my
Hmm.
soul, you know.
Yeah.
So back at you, you've written a lot of different ways. I remember your short fiction. I certainly read your nonfiction. It's the first novel I've ever read of yours.
Hmm.
What's writing doing for you? Put it that way.
Okay, so there's the Irish poet Seamus Heaney,
Mhm.
and one of my favorite poems by him is called "Personal Helicon." Helicon being the mountain where the Greek gods, got where inspiration was from. And he's got a poem that poem has four stanzas, and each stanza is him remembering when he was a young child, looking into a well, like a water well, one time with his grandfather and one time by himself, and so on. And at the end, the last stanza, he says, "I don't do that anymore because that's sort of childish. But now," he says, "I rhyme to see myself, to set the darkness echoing." And I just love that. That I rhyme to see myself, to set the darkness echoing. So I'm not a poet, but that still means a lot to me, that couplet, or that those two lines,
Which poem was that
because
again? Which poem?
that's Personal Helicon by
Oh, I gotta
Seamus.
look that up. Mhm.
Because I guess that's why I write. It's you said a way of exploration, self-exploration. And yeah, I feel like through my writing with my nonfiction and now more lately with fiction, it's like plumbing one's depths, getting a better sense of oneself.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's fun. It's how I want to spend the rest of my remaining years.
I love it. I
Yeah.
mean, I want to say too, I think she might be online. I'm not sure. Your lovely wife, Melanie,
Yes, she is. Yep, she's with
said
Tom.
something one time that, again, if she didn't know, I carry it with me all the time. That you said, and you can correct me on the quote, that Melanie writes, she's a poet, she writes herself into the world.
That's right. Yeah.
That's a lovely thought. And I think about that, you know,
Yeah.
because, and again, even in mind, people, it's not like, by the way, if you pick up your Luke Fisher novels, don't look for deep spiritual stuff in them. They are a lot of fun, but the more I write, stuff starts to emerge because I
Hmm.
can't not think that way, you
Hmm.
know, and I think that you and I are similar to that. We've had many, many deep conversations over the years about exploring. And I love the idea of like, what'd you say? Like in rhyme. I'm listening to myself in rhyme.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's how I find myself through rhyme. Yeah.
Is there any
I
more
wonder.
questions?
Well, I'm wondering. They always say you should leave people wanting more, and I'm wondering if we should wrap things up. Um,
Probably should.
I think my friend Al Marshall there. I think he's got some Unabomber stuff to go and do. He's
Okay, so we got to go. Like, I agree with you. Two things I'm going to say here in
yeah.
closing.
Yeah. Yep.
Robin mentioned, I heard a writer say, stop sharpening pencils and just write. That is so, so true.
Hmm.
Because as an illustrator, that's another thing. You can either sharpen your pencils. I knew a guy, that's all he did. But
I know who you mean.
I know you know who I mean, right?
Yeah.
But also the last thing, and I didn't really talk about, I've talked about my influences before, but is there a novel that either of you um, would describe as being categorically perfect? You know, I don't know if I can just gonna land on one or not.
Well, for me, it would again be Cormac McCarthy, but this time it would be Blood Meridian. Yeah.
What a choice. I mean, and that's the thing too. I read Blood Meridian over Christmas break one time. It was a
Mhm.
fun way to spend Christmas.
Yeah.
A book
I
that
think
really
it's the
stayed.
greatest. I think it's the greatest American novel, maybe with the exception of Moby Dick.
Oh, okay. You took both of mine. All right. Um, for me, the only one I would add to that canon is DeLillo's Underworld.
Yeah, yeah,
It's,
yeah. I
it's
really like that, especially the first section at the baseball game, and
baseball game.
it's
Yeah.
perfect. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
I think you're right. We're getting thanks and stuff, which is wonderful. I'm really glad that people joined us. Um, Mark, you can pick up your books and my books on Amazon and in some bookstores. I don't know. Are you in bookstores?
Yeah, pretty much everywhere. Or if people want, they can go to markmorton.ca and they can
Hmm.
find out more about my books and where to buy them and see reviews, things like that.
Are you on social media much?
Uh, well, not much, not
No,
much.
I'm just saying where people can find you. So the
Yeah, yeah.
website's good.
It's markmorton.ca, and I think
Yep,
I've got some links to Facebook and stuff there. Yeah.
sure. And my name, Terlson, is conveniently a strange spelling of a name, and I'm pretty easy to find online, and I'm on all the social media all the time. Anyways, this is going to be, it has been recorded.
Yes,
So
that's great.
we'll make this available to people. And
Yeah.
I'll say goodnight at this point and thank everyone again for joining us. And Mark, great to see you. We
Yeah.
talk some more.
You too. You too. Okay. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for your
Thanks,
time.
everyone.
Really
Good
appreciate
night.
it. Bye bye.